Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 257th, offered on Thursday, December 12th, 2019 at noon Eastern, we've got Brad Wood, who's going to be talking on Please Pass the Salt, Serve Up Passwords with a Side of Entropy. And with that, we'll turn it over to you, Brad. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, Charlie. Okay. Hopefully now you all can see my screen.
Okay, good.
Perfect. Okay, so like Charlie said, this topic is Please Pass the Salt, Serve Up Passwords with a Side of Entropy, because I like titles that apparently have food references. Who's ready for lunch, right? So I am Brad Wood. I never know what my title is. I always make up a different one. I'm some kind of software doohickey for the Ortus Solutions people, makers of Coldbox, and I'm the lead developer of the CommandBox CLI. And if you want to yell at me afterwards, I'm on Twitter. Here's my Twitter handle. So application security is a topic that should hopefully be dear to our hearts as application developers. And there's a lot of aspects to it. SQL injection, remote code execution or RCE, zero-day exploits, cross-site scripting, all sorts of stuff. This talk isn't meant to be any sort of grand overview or a WASP top 10 or anything. It's really just more of a focused talk that really zeroes in on password storage. Specifically, that's something that I've always found interesting, and I've also found misunderstood by a lot of developers who think they're doing it right, but they're not quite hitting the mark on that. So that's where I'd gotten the idea for something that's kind of focused on how we store our passwords. So I would be remiss if I talked about this and I didn't include this famous XKCD cartoon. I apologize if the font's a little too small to read, but I'll go through it. This cartoon is perfect because it sort of sums up everything I talk about in this talk. And it talks about what we do with passwords. So the title says, through 20 years of effort, we've successfully trained everyone to use passwords that are hard for humans to remember, but easy for computers to guess, which is, of course, is the opposite of what we want to do. So here we have an example password that may meet the password requirements of your local banking software in that top frame, right? Uncommon, non-gibberish base word, unknown order, capitals, numbers, special characters, right? And so then it calculates, well, how many bits of entropy is that? And I'll talk about what entropy means here in a later on slide. It basically means kind of how random it is. So it's 28 bits of entropy. So it says it would take you only 3 days for a computer to guess that password if you could take 1,000 guesses a second. So difficulty to guess, easy for a computer, right? Difficulty to remember for the human, well, hard. Was it trombone? No, it was troubadour. And there was a zero, there was an O, wasn't there a symbol? Right? Hard to remember. It's actually pretty easy for a computer to guess. So in the next pane, it has another potential password. Correct horse battery staple. 4 random common words, all lowercase, no numbers, no special characters, nothing like that. 44 bits of entropy. And entropy is exponential. So it's not just twice the entropy. That's actually exponentially more entropy. That would take 550 years at 1,000 guesses a second. So the difficulty of a computer to be able to put all the kind of like all the monkeys in front of typewriters will create the works of Shakespeare, right? The difficulty of a computer to randomly guess that is actually really hard. And the difficulty to remember is, well, you've probably already memorized it. So this cartoon kind of really hits to the point of what we put people through to create what we feel are secure passwords. And the reality is oftentimes the passwords really aren't necessarily secure at all. They're just really hard for us to remember. And I think that happens a lot when the developer team doesn't actually have a say in the password requirements. They kind of come down from some marketing or business team that just does what sounds good. So I shouldn't have to have this slide, but unfortunately I've had to explain to CIOs in the past why we even needed to bother securing the passwords in our database. I would actually be asked, can't we just store them in plain text? What's all this hash nonsense you guys want to do? So it's sad that sometimes you actually have to justify even the most basic sort of encryption or hashing. So you have to remember the internet's not a friendly place. You may leave your front door unlocked when you drive to McDonald's, But in the internet, it's not your friendly street. You have hackers hiding behind your front bushes, right? So almost every site stores some level of personal data about users. Um, I've had people say to me, well, our site doesn't have any data worth hacking, right? I mean, really, who would want our database? But that's not really true. I mean, just names, email addresses, and passwords can be a juicy enough target that a hacker would want to try to get access to your database. Vulnerable sites are often found by bot scanners that have searched the internet. So it's not that a hacker sat down one day and thought, that company, I bet they have data I could get. Oftentimes, it's just bots looking for vulnerabilities on web servers, and if they can find one, they'll scrape your database, right? And of course, security comes in layers best, right? Just like ogres and onions. So, what if a hacker gets access to your database, to your source code, to both? You need to sort of have mitigation at multiple levels. So, it's your job, you people out there in the audience, in your nice padded seats that Charlie provides you, it's your job to mitigate the fallout of some, if some, or even all of your architecture is breached. And oftentimes, the people giving you requirements, your product owner, will not always bake these requirements into the projects they give you. You have to say, well, hold on, we need an extra sprint to make sure we've addressed the security of the application. So if you don't speak up, oftentimes nobody else will. So according to the survey linked here, and I actually, while I'm talking about this right now, let me just grab it. I have a link to the slide deck. I'll just give it to you guys now. And the slide deck I have a bunch of links and references at the bottom of my slides. There we go, it's in the chat. All right, so 80%. According to 1,000 respondents in a survey, more than 80% of folks age 18 and up reuse the same password across multiple accounts. And that's important because it means that even though you may run a website that you would consider a very low value target for hackers, people log into your website to, who knows, bookmark pages on the internet, right? How many of your users reuse the same password for their banking website or for their email, which, a cracked email account can be used to reset passwords for all sorts of things. So you have to think about the fact that the data in your database, potentially, those usernames and passwords, are shared between other possibly higher value sites out of the internet. So it's always important to protect that. So a little bit of terminology. We'll go through and discuss all this, but there's a lot of words, a lot of jargon in kind of the crypto community. It can make it more confusing to have a conversation if we're on different pages of what we're talking about. A cipher is the output of an encryption algorithm. It's also a character in the matrix, but that's not what we're talking about today. A digest is the output of a hash algorithm. Encryption is a reversible mechanism to secure information. So when you take a string and you encrypt it, you can reverse that. A hash is a non-reversible mechanism where output is determined by the input. We'll talk about that. Symmetric key encryption means you use the same secret key for both the encryption and the decryption of the data. Asymmetric key encryption is where you have public and private keys, and that's what you have with like SSH, for instance. Salt is not just something I put on my French fries. It's extra data that you add to input to increase randomness, and randomness, as we'll find out in these oncoming slides, will be really what a lot of this boils down to. Rainbow tables are a form of a lookup table used to brute force hashed passwords. Rainbow tables are pretty cool. I mean, they're bad, but they're cool. Rainbow tables show just how much effort hackers will go through to figure out your users' passwords, basically. And of course, plain text is the worst way in the world to store your passwords, but hopefully you already knew that. So let's start there. We're going to work our way up. Plain text bad. Unfortunately, storing things in plain text passwords is more common than you think, and it really makes hackers' lives much easier. The first time I implemented any kind of login, I totally stored my passwords in plain text, but I mean, I thought that Access database I was using was pretty much impenetrable. I mean, how would people ever get to it, right? Exactly. I think I stored it in the web root of my web application at the time. It was back in like ColdFusion 4.5. Please don't do this. There's people who still do this. Stop doing it, right? And honestly, it doesn't have to just be passwords. Plain text data could include credit card numbers, social security numbers, any personal sort of sensitive information that if a user was to have that information stolen, someone could steal their identity or access other parts of their life. But don't do that. Plain text bad. So we're going to talk about some real exploits. These are examples of companies that used what the password storage technique we just discussed, and it didn't work out well for them. So here's Yahoo. In 2012, Yahoo had 453,000 plain text passwords stolen. In 2012 really wasn't that long ago. I know it's been a few years, but they should have known better at that point. This particular attack, and of course I have the link there below if you want to read more about them. Matching email addresses were stolen as well. Hackers used SQL injection vulnerability to export the entire database. SQL injection is one of my favorite exploits to study. I think it's one of the most commonly used ones, to be honest. The attack also gained access to all of the MySQL Server variables, names of all the database tables and database columns. So the entire schema of the database was discovered. And some interesting statistics came out of this is the most common password was 123456. So about 1,500 users all used that password. And then the word password, just the actual word password, was the next most common password, used nearly 1,000 times. And then, of course, the word password was used as the base for over 1,000 other passwords, like password 1, password 2. So there's an example of people using plain text. It doesn't work out. If a hacker is able to get access to the database, it's like you're just handing them the key. So our takeaways are, first of all, prevent against SQL injection, right? It's a super common attack vector. Lock down your database user so they can't see the schema. If you're running your database user as root on MySQL or SA on SQL Server, don't do that. All it takes is a good SQL injection vulnerability, and then you can do all sorts of nasty things, especially even SQL Server. Hackers use the Yahoo data to breach or to break into unrelated accounts of the same users, right? People using the same username and password for other websites. And of course, this system allowed users to use very weak passwords. So it didn't have anything in place that said your password isn't good enough. And of course, don't store passwords in plain text. That should be an obvious takeaway from that one. So what's the next thing up from plain text? What's the next level we can go to? And that would be symmetric encryption. So symmetric encryption is a reversible process. It uses a secret key for both the encryption and the decryption. So you have to know not only the algorithm being used for the encryption, but the secret key. But it's really only suitable for information you need back in plain text. And you might think, well, don't I need the password back in plain text? The answer is no. We'll get to that when we talk about hashing. So here's an example of actually the CFML encrypt function. You give it the string mypass. It gives you back what appears to be a somewhat random string of characters. You can pass that back into decrypt along with your key, and you get the original string back. This may sort of look good just because you look at the encrypted form and you're like, well, hey, that's nothing like the text mypass. That's pretty good, right? But it's not. It's not really. One-way encryption is very easily broken if someone just accesses your source code and they can see what your key is and they can figure out what the encryption algorithm is. I mean, there's only so many encryption algorithms, and the default encryption algorithm for ColdFusion is absolutely horrible. It's like the XOR or something. It's really just like a basic bit shifting encryption. Very, very easily hacked. So while it can kind of maybe look good because you don't have plain text anymore, it can be very easy to reverse engineer just a normal symmetric encryption. One of the big issues with it used like this is that the key is the same for all users. So all you need to know is the algorithm that was used and the key that was used, and if you access the database of encrypted passwords, you can turn those all back around into plain text. So here's another real exploit of a company named Adobe, you may have heard of, that did this. I'm not picking on any companies, by the way. I literally just Googled and found exploits that matched each of these. So in 2013, only a year after Yahoo's, Adobe had 130 million passwords stolen. They used unsalted DES symmetric encryption. So that unsalted just means that the password just straight up is encrypted, nothing else is added to it. Unsalted means no salts were added. The keys were not stolen, but since the encryption was not salted, all the identical passwords had the same cipher. So if 1,000 people have the password, I like spam, right, then the encrypted version of that was identical in the database. So you could find all of the users that had the same password, and once you had hacked one of them, you had hacked all of them. Adobe also had a plain text password hint that gave away a lot of the passwords. So when you created your account, they allowed you to put in a hint in case you ever forgot your password. And guess what? A lot of people just type their password right into the hint box. Because if they ever forget it, they just want it to be dead easy, right? You can't trust people to use that well. So the password hint column just handed most of the passwords to the hackers. This was a legacy system scheduled for decommission, but guess what? It was still live, and if it's still live, it's still part of the surface area of your company. It's still something that can be attacked. So the hackers determined and published, because that's what hackers do, right? They put all your secrets on the internet. They published the top 100 passwords, which was a very interesting list. 1.9 million accounts used, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. About 500,000 people used 1 through 9. Humans are very uncreative, right? And then the next most used ones were the word password, Adobe 1, 2, 3, and then 1 through 8. So it's interesting to see some of the patterns that people do. So Adobe had used slightly more protection than plain text, but it really didn't afford them much because it was very easy for that to be reverse engineered. I believe that, I forget the numbers, but I think a very high percentage of the records in that database, they were able to divine the original plain text passwords even without the key. But that lack of salt really made it easy. So the takeaways are your legacy systems are still a liability until they go offline, right? You're responsible for those. And I'll tell you right now, legacy systems that are quote-unquote on the verge of being phased out have a sneaky tendency to stick around for years and years. I don't know how many people I've talked to that say, oh, we're going to get rid of that system in the next 6 months. We don't need to do anything to it. And 4 years later, it's still there. This system allowed users to use very weak passwords again. Password hints were abused. Oftentimes, just gave the password away. Instead, you should use some sort of secure password reset process. So if someone forgets their password, you take something that only they would have, like access to their email address, right? And you send them an email with a link that can only be used once, that expires in a day, and they click on that link and they answer some security questions, and then and only then you say, okay, give a new password. The password hint box was just abused, and it turned into a gold mine for the hackers to use. Reversible encryption was used. Luckily, the symmetric key was not stolen, but the lack of salt made it possible for lookup tables to be applied to all the users since the ciphers were identical. So a hacker can take that encryption algorithm, which was DES, Symmetric Encryption. They can take that algorithm, they can run it through a few million or billion or trillion possible password strings, generate a lookup table of all the encrypted versions of those, and then just match them up. It's not that hard. And of course, hackers use this Adobe data to break into unrelated accounts of the same users because people reuse passwords. And the takeaway is don't use unsalted reversible encryption. So now we move to hashing. Hopefully most of you are at least at this phase. Unfortunately, a lot of people stop about here. They make it to hashing, they've heard it's best practice, and they don't make it any farther. But there's a lot more than just using hashing. Hashing is irreversible, so the plain text cannot be retrieved from the digest. If I take a plain text string and I hash it, I take the digest and I hand it to you, you can never, ever, ever apply any algorithm that will recreate the plain text. Hashes always have an output of a predetermined length. So like an MD5 hash is like, I don't know, 30 characters or something. I forget the exact number of characters. So if you hash the entire text of War and Peace, the book, you would get out of it the same 30, 40 characters worth of output, right? So information is definitely lost. The thing is, it's deterministic. A deterministic function always returns the same output regardless of the inputs that were given to it. So no two inputs produce the same digest, and if they do, then that hashing algorithm is considered broken. Those are called hash collisions. MD5, by the way, has hash collisions that have been found. Now, they're not very common. They're pretty wild examples, but MD5 is considered broken due to the hash collisions. If two inputs can produce the same output, that's a bad thing for your hashing algorithm. Now, like I said, it does lose the original information, but it is repeatable. You do get the same digest every time, and that's what's important. So when a user logs in, they give you their plain text password in the password field. You hash that using your hashing algorithm, and when you compare the digest to what you have in the database. So you don't ever need to have their plain text password. That means if the user forgets the password, you can't look it up for them. You just can't. Unfortunately, I've had companies tell me, well, that's a business requirement. We need people to be able to call in over the phone and just read them their plain text password back over the phone. You don't understand. Why are you storing it with some ridiculous hash on it so we can't see it? And it was an awkward conversation to try to explain to them why that was horrible, that they would just tell people passwords over the phone, presumably with some sort of verification that they even were who they were saying they were. What's much better is, again, a secure password reset process where if you forget your password, you send an email, all the stuff I talked about 2 slides back. But you can't get those plain text passwords back. And here we have an example. At the bottom, this is just the ColdFusion hash function, which, again, I told you that the default encryption algorithm in ColdFusion sucks, right? Guess what? The default hashing algorithm in ColdFusion also sucks. It's just MD5. MD5 is very common and has some good uses, but it is not good for passwords. We'll talk about why here in a couple slides. So, another real exploit. This one, again in 2013, poor Yahoo. They've had a lot of problems. This one was a huge exploit. 1 billion passwords were stolen. Later on, it was claimed it was actually possibly up to 3 billion. I can't even fathom a database that large, but Yahoo's been around for a long time. In this database, passwords were hashed, but they were hashed with MD5 hashing algorithm. MD5 is very common, it's very old, and it's also very fast. And you might think fast is good, right? No, wrong. Fast is actually bad in this case because fast means it's easier for hackers to generate millions and millions of potential hashes until they find the right one. In this case, salting, again, pardon me, was not used. That means that everybody with the same password had the exact same hash. So once the database was accessed, if they figured out one person's password and that there were 1,000 other people that had used the same plain text password, they'd instantly hacked all 1,000 of them at the same time. Also stolen were names, email addresses, phone numbers, date of birth, security questions, and answers. This is an interesting hack because it was alleged to have been a state-sponsored actor, and what that means, that's a really fancy word for saying another government of a country somewhere else in the world actually did this themselves. It wasn't just a guy in his mom's basement on dial-up, right? This is quite possibly another evil regime somewhere that may have perpetrated the hack. Okay, so our takeaways. Again, lack of salt means all the same passwords had the same hash digest. So when 1,000 people have the same password, they had the same they had the same digest rather, and that means that you can hack all of them at the same time. It's very easy to create lookup tables. MD5 is a very, very fast algorithm. Makes it faster to brute force. MD5 is still used a lot and is very handy with package managers. When you looking like a Maven repo, you'll have some jar file you're downloading, and then you'll have another file that contains an MD5 hash. And because you can MD5 hash anything, it can be binary input, it doesn't matter. As long same input always gives you the same output in text. And so what those are used for is when you download the file, your computer hashes what it downloads, compares it to the hash that the server says you should have gotten, and if the hashes don't match, the file was either corrupted over the course of a download, or maybe the file had been maliciously swapped out on the server. And MD5 is very useful for that because you can hash a file that's hundreds of megabytes worth of binary, and you get a result very quickly out of it. It's useful for that, but it's not good that it's fast when it comes to passwords because you can brute force them far too quickly. MD5 is also considered broken, like I mentioned, due to some hash collisions, so it's not even recommended. It's really a shame it's the default algorithm for the hash function of ColdFusion, but due to backwards compatibility, I don't know that that'll ever change as the default. Extensive lookup tables already exist for MD5 hashes, and a lookup table, again, is just a table that has every possible plain text combinations of letters and characters you can imagine, and then the hash of that password, and you can just use them as like a reverse lookup, basically. And those you can use any algorithm you want. I've played around creating lookup tables just to kind of learn more about how they work. And you just start with A, B, A, B, C, A, B, C, D, right? You just go through all the combinations. Or maybe you start with all the words in the dictionary. So most of the passwords in this database, is 1 billion or more passwords, were all converted back to plain text. Even though they were hashed with MD5, which is what a lot of people use, it really just wasn't secure enough. It's too easy to reverse. So let's stop and let's talk about a dictionary attack. A dictionary attack sort of takes the the idea that most passwords aren't random, but they're based on dictionary words, because users are typically trying to make it something they can remember. So when creating rainbow tables, like we've been talking about, focusing on common words or phrases can eliminate billions of unlikely passwords. This is actually a list of the top passwords. So there's hundreds, possibly thousands of examples of databases that have been stolen, reverse engineered, and hackers will publish the passwords on the internet. They'll just take your passwords and they'll stick them out there for everyone in the world to see because they don't care, right? So this article here, somebody had gone through, they'd combed through all these databases of passwords that have been accessed, and they came up with the top worst passwords. So 1234556, which we've seen a couple times now, is literally the most commonly used password on the internet, taking the sample size of all the databases that have been hacked, right? Behind that, we have passwords, some variations of numbers that are very uncreative. Sunshine rings in as the first actual dictionary word. QWERTY. There's some funny ones in there. Charlie, I guess, is the 21st most used password. Donald, maybe it's all those Donald Trump fans using that one. I don't know. Number 20 is funny because if you hold down the shift key and just run your finger down the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, those are exactly the characters you get. But hackers, they know this, right? They study this. So if you're going to create a lookup table of all the possible MD5 hashes, you know what they start with? They start with lists like this. They start with the dictionary. They start with things they know people are going to use, and that makes their life even easier because now they don't have to do every single possible combination of the alphabet. They can start with these really common ones and get a very high percentage of hits. And that leads us into entropy. Entropy is our friend here because that's what slows the hackers down. Entropy is basically a measurement of how unpredictable a password is. Right? It's a measurement of how unpredictable your password is. Predictable meaning how many random combinations of letters and numbers would you have to stick together until you came up with my password. So it's measured in bits, which represents all the log 2 of the possible variations that can be represented. And so we'll talk about how that works. All the possible passwords are calculated as the character set to the power of the length. Right, the length of the password. So the character set being if you allow people to use passwords that only use lowercase alphabetic characters, there's only 26 possible characters, right? 26 letters in the alphabet, assuming you're typing in English. And at the length of the password, if you allow people to use a password that say 6 digits or less, then your possible maximum length would be 6. So here's an example. A password with a length of 5 characters using only lowercase alphabet is 26 to the power of 5, or about 11 million possible combinations. So that equals about 23.5 bits of entropy. So that's what was being referenced in that cartoon at the beginning. And so entropy is kind of just a bit of a measuring stick that tells you based on your requirements that you put on the user, how many possible tries would a program have to go through. So 11 million, almost 12 million. So if you knew that a database used MD5 and didn't have any salts, you could create 12 million different hashes of all the possible combinations of. You can take five lowercase digits, or not digits, but letters, and put them in a different order. One of those would match. You would be able to figure it out, right? So we can add entropy by increasing the length of the password, right? Your password has to be 8 characters or 10 characters, or we can force people to add a larger character set. So we require uppercase characters, we require numbers, we require special characters, right? And we see that quite a bit. That's pretty common for banking websites and things like that. They'll say you have to have at least 8 characters, you have to have special things, right? Both of those are all about added entropy, adding the number of possible combinations, so hackers will have to go through more effort if they're going to try to brute force your password. And it's also worth noting, unless forced otherwise, most users will typically just use alphanumeric characters. If you just leave users to their own devices, they'll typically choose pretty basic passwords. So let's dig into entropy a little bit farther. We won't get too mathy, so don't get too scared. So a common password requirement I see quite a bit is 8 characters long, pretty standard. Uppercase, lowercase numbers, and at least 1 special character. I think I've signed up for a lot of websites that do this, right out, just like that. So what does that give us? 56 alphabetic characters, right? 26 upper, 26 lower, 10 numeric digits, 0 through 9, and depending on what keyboard you have, about 15 punctuation characters, comma, dash, hyphen, tilde, all that good stuff. So that means if we were to calculate the entropy, a password meeting these requirements would be 81 to the power of 8. So 81 possible characters, 8 characters long. So that is, what is this number here? 1,000, million, billion, trillion, quadrillion. 1.8 quadrillion passwords is how many possible combinations you could have of that. So that's 50.7 bits of entropy. And again, entropy is exponential. So the larger that those entropy bits get, that's an exponentially larger number, right? So that sounds pretty good, right? I mean, I think my banking website right now probably has these exact requirements: 8 digits, upper, lower numbers, special characters, 1.8 quadrillion passwords. How could they possibly hack this, right? So if you could do 1 million guesses per second, it would take you 59 years to generate all the possible combinations to create a lookup table for this. If you could do maybe 1 billion guesses per second, pretty optimistic, right? You could crack that in 21 days, generate all the possible combinations. Imagine some future dystopian world, right, where you could do like 350 billion guesses per second, right? You could hack that in 1.5 hours, right? But that would never happen, right? I mean, that's sort of crazy talk. Wrong. This guy here is your password's worst nightmare. This is actually not even that recent. This is a 25 GPU cluster of AMD Radeon graphics cards. Graphics cards are good at floating point math, which is used heavily in hashing, which is why people use them for cryptocurrency, because Bitcoin is all based on hashing. Guess what this bad boy can do? 350 billion guesses per second. Ooh, dear, we just said that was ridiculous. Guess what? This is from 2012. Hackers have had the ability to guess 350 billion guesses per second when creating lookup tables, and that was 7 years ago. So it can try 95 to the power of 8 combinations in just 5.5 hours. That means it can create 6.6 quadrillion passwords in less than a working day. Every possible 8-character password containing upper, lower, digits, symbols, they were able to crack every standard Windows password in less than 6 hours. And like I said, that was 7 years ago. So you may be surprised to realize just how advanced of tooling hackers have. You think to yourself, back on this slide, oh, well, this is so far out. Who could ever hack this, right? Our requirements are foolproof. Hackers, given, the indigest, they'd never be able to go through all the possible combinations. Well, you guessed wrong. When you're using a fast password algorithm like MD5, you can create millions and millions of MD5 hashes in a single second on a standard desktop computer. So a fast hashing algorithm with only 8 characters or so is not that hard just to go through and blow through every possible combination. So once your database is accessed, it's just a matter of time, and it's not that much time. That should kind of scare you. So let's talk about entropy, because it's really all about creating so many possible combinations, it would be impossible for a hacker to go through and generate all the combinations, right? So entropy grows exponentially, like we talked about. So what produces the higher yield in entropy? Increasing the set of possible characters, which is our base number, that's x, or increasing the length of the password, which is the exponent. If anybody wants to take a quick stab at that, I'll wait a couple seconds before I change the slide. What do you guys think? What will give you more entropy? Making your users have longer passwords, or increasing the number of characters you have them put in their password? Anybody want to take a guess in the chat? I'll give just a couple seconds before I change the slide. And I promise it's not a trick question. Jeff Davis is typing. All right, Jeff Davis says the base. Charlie says the length. Ooh, both. Well, you are correct. They both do increase entropy, Drew, but one increases it more. Okay. Drum roll. Increasing the exponent produces a higher yield. And of course, if we go back, the exponent is the length of the password. So making a user have a longer password gives you far, far, far higher entropy than making the user use all sorts of crazy characters. So let's take a look at it. Longer passwords have more entropy than more complex ones. And that's exactly what the cartoon at the beginning of our slide deck showed us. So let's try it out, right? We start with 5 to the power of fifth. So a 5-character password with 5 possible digits, that's 3,000 combinations. Simple example. So if we increase the base, right? So, I said that backwards. Well, I didn't say it backwards because they're both 5. If we increase the base, which is the possible set of characters, so we make the user use 6 possible characters, but it's still a length of 5, we only increase the number of possible combinations of the entropy by a small amount. There's now 7,000 possible combinations. But if we let the user still use 5 possible characters, but we force them to use a password with a length of 6, so we increase the length, now we jump up to 15,000 possible combinations. So that's 5-fold increase. So the exponent has, no surprise, an exponential increase in the number of possible combinations. And that's important. And it's also a bit of a tragedy because, like I said in that first slide, companies everywhere have gotten so focused on the uppercase, lowercase, special character crap that they send users in circles, patting themselves in the back, thinking, oh, what secure passwords we've created. We made them use special characters. This is impenetrable. No, you're wrong. They're going about it. They get so focused on that because it looks more secure, right? All it is harder to remember. A longer password that's all lowercase characters can be exponentially more difficult to crack via brute force hacking if it's just twice the length, because that exponent gives us exponentially more entropy. This graph blew my mind. Let me explain what's going on here. It's a pretty simple graph once you kind of get the idea of it. So we have multiple lines going on. This graph shows you the possible number of combinations of passwords and how long it would take to hack them all. So our y-axis going up is the time it would take to try all combinations, and that's very generously assuming 93 trillion guesses per second. All right, as computers advance, that'll get faster. And then along the x-axis, we have the password length, right? So starting with a password that's only a handful of digits long, up to 10 digits long, 20-character passwords, 30-character, 40-character, 50-character, right? And you can see as the length of the password increases, the number of tries takes longer as well. And you see there's some kind of markers that says it takes you this long to blink. So if your password has about 8 characters, they can hack that in the time it takes to blink, right? If your password's about 12 characters, it would take about 400 years. Maybe if your password is even a little bit longer, around 20 characters, it would take until the sun died. Now, if you've watched a lot of Doctor Who, it seems like the sun dies a lot because they keep revisiting that episode. But the sun's actually going to be around for a while, so that's a long time. So what's interesting, what's actually kind of mind-blowing about this graph is the different color lines represent different character sets. So the blue line at the bottom is all just straight up lowercase, A through Z, right? You would think that would be like the worst password ever. Oh my gosh, I would hack that very quickly. The purple line is all lowercase, uppercase, numbers, and all those special characters, right? So basically a password that's just impossible for your poor, sorry users to remember. And the amazing thing about this graph is how little difference there is ultimately between the blue line and the purple line. If you look at that, the blue line is only slightly more hackable than the purple line in the grand scheme of things. The password length is really what makes the difference here. Adding all those characters and all those hoops you make your users jump through is really hardly affecting an ultimate brute force attack on your database. It's the password length that ultimately provides more entropy than you could ever hope for or imagine. Which all goes back to that first cartoon. Everybody gets stuck on the special characters because they think that somehow makes the password more secure, but it doesn't. It just makes it impossible to remember. Making someone have a 20-character password that could just be a movie quote that nobody else could guess, right, would give you trillions more times entropy than not. So, okay, enough on that. So, rainbow tables. We talked about lookup tables. Lookup tables are just a basic every possible combination and the resulting hash digest, right? Rainbow tables are a variation on those, and I won't go into exactly how they work because they're actually pretty geeky. It's kind of cool how they work. The necessity for rainbow tables really boils down to the fact that there isn't a database around that can store, quadrillions of records, right? We just don't have that. So rainbow tables allow you to not store every single possible combination, but to basically create a sort of a chain of hashes that still let you crack like 98% worth of passwords. So rainbow tables are available readily on the internet. They're basically a form of a lookup table. They map pre-computed hashes back to the plain text input. So they're optimized lookups to brute force just billions and billions of hashes to plain text, but they don't necessarily store every single possible combination. So they're pre-computed, and the current hardware limitations basically control the number of combinations. So what that means is, as hardware improves, CPUs get faster, people will be able to generate larger rainbow tables. It's your job to stay out ahead of the hackers, right? You have to keep enough entropy in your passwords that you're dangling the carrot so far out, current hardware won't allow them to brute force it. Pre-made tables are basically ineffective against salted passwords. When you salt the password, and we have a slide on that coming up, that means that every single user in your database would need a separate rainbow table created for them. If you don't salt your passwords, you could use the same rainbow table to hack everybody at once. That's why salting is so important, because all of a sudden, figuring out all the records in your database just got a lot harder, because now you'd have to do a rainbow table for every single user. Here's a screenshot of a website, projectrainbowcrack.com. You can go there right now and you can download yourself some rainbow tables. And so you see there's different, these are usually several gigs in size. I mean, these larger ones are nearly 700 gigs. You download this, and it's basically a giant database that contains the rainbow table. So you see they have MD5 hash, ASCII characters, 1 character password through 7 character passwords, right? So it's a smaller character set. So that rainbow table has a success rate of 99.9%. If you have an MD5 hash password that's within 7 characters, you can apply that rainbow table to it, and you can crack it pretty easy, right? And then, of course, they kind of grow from there. So the one at the bottom is probably the largest one, MD5, lowercase, alphanumeric, and it goes up to 10-digit passwords. You'll notice that this particular screenshot here, they don't have anything going larger than a 10-character password. The reason is, once you get past 10 characters, you're dealing with just like tons and tons of possible combinations. Because remember, the length is really what gives you the entropy. So rainbow tables don't exist today, really, for passwords past about 10 characters or so, because it would take years to generate them. But just know that'll slowly creep up as hardware increases. But these are out there on the internet, and these are what hackers use. These are ready available. They download them. Once they've accessed your database, they can use these rainbow tables. So our goal is to get the number of possible combinations so far out that rainbow tables are ineffective. So let's talk about salting. Salting is additional data. You add it to the original text to increase the entropy, or the randomness, right? So the salt pushes the length of the hash string well past the threshold of the characters in a pre-computed rainbow table. So these rainbow tables here go up from, passwords are about 7 to 10 characters long, right? If you want to allow a user to put in a password that's only 8 characters, what if you add, say, 30 characters of random data onto the end of their password before you hash it? That's now a 38-character password. And the largest rainbow table we have here only goes up to a 10-character password. So if you can not arbitrarily, but artificially take an 8-character password and turn it into a 38-character password, you just push the entropy of that well past the off-the-shelf rainbow tables that exist right now. So the salt should be different for every user. That's the whole point of salt, right? You don't use the same salt for everybody, otherwise it might not exist, or it doesn't serve any purpose. So every single user has a different salt. So if a hacker was to access your database, and let's say they knew what your password algorithm was, and let's say even if they knew what your salt was, they would still have to go through and create a rainbow table fresh for every single different user of your database, because the salt would completely change all the possible outcomes, right? So this makes it a lot harder. So the salts are generally stored right alongside the digest. People don't typically try to hide the salt. In some cases, people would just use like the user ID. of the user as the salt. However, best practice is that you should use a salt that's at least as long as the output of the hashing algorithm. Salts can be rotated or changed anytime the password changes. So if you have users change their password every 6 months or something, you can swap out for a fresh salt. And if it would take hackers, 6 months to generate a rainbow table, and the salt changes every 6 months, they'd never be able to get in front of that, right? I already said that bullet. The salt should be as long as the digest. What that means, like an MD5 digest is like 30, 40 characters long. So your salt should be like a GUID, something generic and decently long. So from a brute force perspective, it's all about pushing that base number out, right? Then the length of the password. Wait, it's not the base, it's the exponent. It's the length of the password, right? Number of possible combinations. There's also a thing called work factor. We talked about how MD5 was very fast, right? And we like the fact that it's fast for some cases like verification of file downloads, but fast is not our friend when it comes to hackers creating 350 billion MD5 hashes per second, right? We actually want a hashing algorithm that's specifically slow. So generation of these lookup tables and these rainbow tables are not something hackers can do quickly. This is called key stretching. Like our Stretch Armstrong guy there. So it slows down how many hashes can be performed every second. When hackers can do 350 billion hashes per second, it's really hard for us to store the password with enough entropy that they can't start creating, just all the possible combinations. So we want to make brute forcing so slow it's not feasible. If it's going to take a user, a hacker rather, 100 years to generate a rainbow table, they're going to give up. Well, they might not give up entirely. They'll probably try some social engineering, like, send in a fake phishing email, but they're probably not going to be able to brute force it. They're not going to spend 100 years to brute force. So we purposefully choose slow algorithms. MD5 is bad because it's so fast. So an algorithm like bcrypt allows you to dial in a custom work factor for current CPUs, and they did that with future proofing in mind. The creators of bcrypt said, in the future, processors will get faster, and that means that this algorithm will be less and less effective at being slow, and the algorithm will become faster and faster, but we want it to be able to stay slow without having to rewrite the algorithm. So with bcrypt, you can dial in a work factor that works for your computers, your servers, your CPU cores that you have available. You kind of find the right number, and you want to target about half a second or so. Is a good time. It should take about maybe half a second to generate your hash. You don't want it to be too long, because obviously when the user types in username and password in your site and they whack the login button, they don't want to sit there for 5 minutes before they can get logged in, right? Half a second is something you almost would hardly notice. The page refreshes, 1,000, okay, boom, you're logged in, right? But the difference between a hash that takes a couple nanoseconds and a hash that takes 500 milliseconds is huge when you're talking about generating, a few quadrillion of those puppies. So it can include iterations as well, right? Hashing multiple times. bcrypt kind of takes care of that directly internally. It does the iterations for you. So like I said, about half a second is just fast enough for a user to not notice when they log in, but it's slow enough to completely slow down brute forcing. So if you need to create 1 quadrillion passwords, and it's going to take you half a second for every single one of those, right? That's going to take a lot of universe implosions before you've finally calculated all those. And a hacker's not going to spend that amount of time. You've pushed the entropy, and you've pushed using key stretching, you've pushed the amount of time it takes to create that hash so far out, it's just not feasible any longer for them to create those. And this is why the salting and the key stretching and the password length are so important. Because a lot of people make it to the hashing slide, MD5 hashing, and they stop there. They pat themselves in the back and say, I'm hashing my passwords. This is a job well done. But it's not, right? Like we saw, a regular unsalted MD5 hashing is not that secure. You have to be doing these additional things on top of it. So finally, one final real exploit. This is Quora, just last year in 2018. They had 1 million passwords stolen from a database. Also stolen were names, emails, direct messages. But in this case, the passwords were salted and hashed, and they actually used bcrypt for password storage. There is, in case you're wondering, there is a ColdFusion library for bcrypt. It's out on ForgeBox. I have a link in one of the last slides. So they use bcrypt, which uses iterations, thousands of hashes. It has a work factor that slows it down, and it salts it so the passwords are very long, and that's what they had inside their database. So the takeaway is the exploit still sucked, right, because they got hacked. There was personal information that was lost, but none of those plain text passwords were likely ever acquired by the hackers due to their use of bcrypt. Even though those digests were visible in the database to the hackers, they weren't ever able to reverse engineer those back into the plain text due to the use of bcrypt, which has iterations, has key stretching, and has salting. So hackers would have needed to have brute force each user's password individually. They wouldn't have been able to hack the entire database at once. And so the amount of effort in that is not really worth it. And brute forcing would have taken a very long time due to the work factor of bcrypt. So while this isn't necessarily a happy ending, this is about the happiest ending you can have. That if someone steals your database, they're basically helpless to figure out what any of the plain text passwords were. This is kind of the best case scenario, right? Okay, so a few best practices here, just to kind of review, right? If you store passwords in plain text, I will in fact come and cut off your fingers. So don't do that, please. Hash, don't encrypt, right? Encryption is one way, it can be reversed. Hashing is, encryption is two-way, rather. It can be reversed. Hashing is one way, it cannot be reversed. That has to be brute forced. Always salt. Don't just take the user's password and directly hash it. You always want to add a salt to it. Of course, again, bcrypt does all this for you. It makes it easy peasy. You want to use a different, highly random salt per user. So not the same salt. Every single user gets their own salt. A GUID is a very good salt to use. Libraries like bcrypt do all of this, and they include the work factor, so your hashes are not quick. If you do use any kind of symmetric key encryption, things like credit card numbers, right, where you might need to get the credit card number back eventually in plain text. Make sure you store those keys outside the code base. Oftentimes in hacks, hackers will be able to actually get access to your ColdFusion source code, and if the key for your encryption is just stored right there in the code, you might as well have not had it, right? So getting keys all the way out into maybe an environment variable, this read in from memory at runtime, is a lot better option. Now, obviously, if the hacker is able to run arbitrary code on your server, they can probably just dump it out of memory. So there's always something they can do, but you want to make it as hard as possible. If you do use keys, store those suckers in memory, read them in as environment variables, something like that. Don't just hand them to the hacker if they access the code. This is on that note. It's also why it's so important to not have those robust error messages turned on by default in ColdFusion, because oftentimes what'll happen is there'll be an error on your site, and those robust error exceptions from ColdFusion will show the lines of code around where the error happened, and those lines of code may have sensitive information like passwords or keys, and that can be exposed directly to the user. So obviously having those secure error pages are important, but that's another use case for absolutely not having things like keys just right there in the source code. Of course, running your database user with limited permissions to cut down on SQL injection attacks. SQL injection is one of the primary ways that databases get exposed. And of course, always retrofit legacy systems, because those are part of your attack surface area. I know it can be a pain if you have a legacy system that's doing plain text or maybe just MD5 hashing. Well, oftentimes what you have to do is do some sort of staggered approach where you introduce a new password column, and as users log in, you take that plain text password, you verify it's correct, and then you apply a new algorithm to it, store it in the new column, and then wipe out the old column, and leave that in place for maybe 6 months. And let's say 80% of your users have logged in or something, and you've converted most of them, and then maybe with the rest of them you can send an email saying, hey, we've updated our password requirements, click here and set a new password. You kind of have to tiptoe around those legacy systems, but it's definitely worth it if that legacy system is going to be there for a while. You don't want to just leave them in there. I also like this quote. This is from Augusta Kirchhoff. I don't know exactly how I'm pronouncing that. This guy was around in the 19th century, and he created cryptographic systems that predated computers, electronic computers. What's pictured there is actually one of the units that he worked with, and they were purely mechanical, which I just think is fantastic. The amount of work that went into making something that complicated. It was all levers and dials. And he had a lot of insight on cryptography long before computers were even a thing. He said a crypto system should be secure even if everything about the system except the key is public knowledge. And a lot of companies try to go through the kind of security through obscurity route, right? Well, if we just don't tell people how we're doing it, they'll never guess. But that's not really a good solution. You have to assume if somebody was able to steal your database and steal your code, and they knew everything about what you use, the algorithm you used, and how you implemented it, but they didn't know what your private keys were, etc., it should still be a secure system. And that's really just to keep in mind that, thinking you've hidden something isn't inherently any more secure. You need to actually make sure you're following the best practices. So even if hackers found out a good deal of information, they still wouldn't be able to hack that. Here's some extra tools to consider on the topic. Consider securing your systems with 2FA or two-factor authentication. This is getting more popular these days. And two-factor basically means your user needs to have a password and some sort of second thing. And usually the second thing will involve a physical device, either a phone or the ability to receive a text message or the ability to receive an email. Once you punch in your password, then you have to, go get a code from your text messages, right? Two-factor authentication. Those slow down the logins. They're complicated and they're more annoying to use. But I have to use it quite a bit. Anytime I deal with government or big corporation VPNs, a lot of those have two-factor authentication. So that's something to look into. There's also some libraries out there. On ForgeBox, we have a library called Dumb Password. It'll verify that a password is not one of the top 10,000 worst passwords. So this library is one Luis made, and it just has a giant text file of all the worst passwords in the world. And if somebody types it in, you can just call a method and say, hey, is this a dumb password? It'll give you back a yes or a no. And you can kick it back out to the user and say, we're not a fan of that password. Why don't you try again? That's an interesting one. This guy here, haveibeenpwned.com, is particularly scary. Let me show you how it works. So you go to haveibeenpwned.com, and this site has collected all sorts of hacked databases that have been leaked out on the internet from actual attacks. So in there, they have 417 hacked databases. All these stuff. You come in here and you put in your email address. So like I've had this brad@bradwood.com email for years. I've probably signed up for 1,000 things, right? I can say, has a database with my email address ever been hacked? And yeah, it totally has, right? Oh no, I've been pwned. So 12 different sites, through no fault of my own, right, have been hacked due to their own lack of security, and my email address was among the database records that were stolen. And it'll actually show you, right? Adobe lost my password. We actually talked about this one, the hack in 2013. Brad@bradwood.com was one of the email addresses that was stolen. There's a mailing list, businesses. A lot of times we get like these MongoDB databases that get stuck out in a web accessible directory. Evite was hacked in 2019, had my email in there. I didn't even know what this is. Geeked In. I didn't think I ever signed up for it. They left a MongoDB database exposed. 8 million records were extracted. A lot of these databases were probably just screen scrapes from the internet, but still it had some data. LinkedIn had a hack in 2016 that had my email address in it. River City spam list, right? It's really scary just to come here, and I know my brad@bradwood.com email has been, hacked in over a dozen different databases. And I think, geez, I used to use the same password for everything. That's horrible, right? I don't anymore, but I used to. I used to have the same password I used for everything because I didn't want to have to remember more than one password. But then I look and I see how many times my email address has turned up on hacked databases. I don't use the same password anymore because that's just not a good thing. I actually use LastPass now, which is a nice browser plugin. They even have an Android app. Every single site I sign up for now, I have a completely different password. So even if that site doesn't use salting, doesn't use hashing, doesn't use all the best practices we talked about, if random site on the internet gets hacked, and hackers figure out the password I use, they can't use that to access my banking site or my email address, right? I don't trust these sites to secure my stuff. Password Meteor is another cool site. It's got a little JavaScript utility. You can implement it on your site that kind of helps users generate secure passwords as well. So that's basically it. hopefully this gives you guys some ideas on what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong. Maybe you have some changes you want to make in how you're storing your passwords. But I can take any questions if you guys have them. I put that link to the slide deck there in the chat already. You can check out my my blog, Coders Revolution. And you, oh, you're right. I mentioned bcrypt. I said it was in the slide deck, and I thought it was, but I was wrong. Let me go pull up that ForgeBox link to bcrypt, and I'll paste it in the Slack. This link here is a ColdBox module, but there's really nothing ColdBox specific. I think you could drop this in and you could just manually instantiate the CFC, and I think it would work all the same. It's a very simple thing that wraps up a jar. All right, there's that link to bcrypt. We use bcrypt on all of our sites, Ordo Solutions. ContentBox uses bcrypt. ForgeBox itself uses bcrypt. It's really good. Okay. Any other questions on stuff that we talked about? Anyone afraid to ask a question because you don't want to admit to how you're storing your passwords? An idea for a semi-related talk. Remember Me login system. You know, I'm a fan of Remember Me login systems, but that's because I'm lazy. I love that the Lucy administrator lets me say Remember Me for a year. It's probably not that good for security if someone was to access my physical computer, but man, I love that. Most Remember Me login systems really have little to do with the password storage, and they'll just be a cookie. An HTTP only cookie with an expiry of however many weeks or days or months you want to remember the user for. And you'll store some key or user ID that the user's logged in as. And then if the user comes back and there's no active session on the server, if the cookie exists, you'll relog them in. The trick with that is you don't want to make the contents of the cookie be something that can be easily guessed, right? If it was just the user ID, well, all you would have to do is define the user ID, even the user in the system, fake a cookie on your browser manually, and then you trick the system into logging them in. So you'd have to store something in the cookie that only that person would know. But most of the Remember Me systems, I believe, just are based on a cookie. It just auto logs you in if you don't have a session. Any other questions? That was a good one. I see some typing, so I'll be patient. All right, if you actually use your password plus UUID is the salt, do you need to store the UUID in order to validate the user password the next time I log in? It depends on what the UUID is. If it's like, say, maybe the user ID because you use GUIDs in your database and you know what it's going to be the next time, then you can just recreate it. If you created a random UUID just using like the create UUID function, yeah, you would need to store that in like a separate column labeled salt or something, and then you could re-append it every time. So if it's not a UUID that you already have somewhere, you would need to store that. And like I mentioned, typically people don't bother trying to secure the salt in any way. The salt is usually just stored plain text. It's just there to bump the length of the password out so far that you would have to create a dedicated lookup table just for that password. Does that make sense, Jamal? Okay, great question. And again, bcrypt does the salt for you. That's what I love about bcrypt, is it takes everything we talked about and it just does all of it. Bcrypt has two methods. One method where you say, here's the plain text password, give me the hash salted, iterated, all that stuff version to store. And then another method that says, okay, here's the incoming plain text and here's the thing I had stored from them, do they match? It's dead easy. And then the only tweaking you have to do is there's a work factor setting that's like a digit from like 1 to 10 or something. And you kind of adjust it up and down, and based on how fast your server is, you kind of do some testing and say, okay, a work factor of 8 takes about half a second. That sounds good. And you can go back and revisit that in the future. If you upgrade your servers and you add twice as many cores, you can test and see how fast bcrypt is behaving, and if you need to, you can bump up the work factor. What's nice is increasing the work factor doesn't invalidate any of your old passwords. So bcrypt is very future-proof in that manner, which is why I like it. Any other questions?
And Brad, while we wait for them to come in, I'm going to go ahead and switch the mode
Go
to
for it.
A, focus on the chat more, and then B, folks, if before you might head off, please do take a moment to fill in the evaluations on the right. And by the way, I noticed the numbers have ticked up in the last couple minutes, which suggests to me that these are people who've come in at the end of the session. And I'm sorry to hear that. The site says that it's at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and I can't get meetup.com to show that time zone. So I say it everywhere I can, but I can't control that yet. Why is there you go.
Yep.
So I don't know, Adrian. It's I've complained to them that it should be relative to your particular time zone, but it doesn't do that. It does it relative to the meetings.
But there will be a recording you can access, though, right, Charlie?
Yes, all these sessions are recorded. This is still being recorded right now, in fact. And I'll tell you what, yeah, exactly. I know you're saying that, Mario. So I have one thought. I had changed the location of the meeting to be where I live, which is in Central Time. And it may be that it's using that somehow internally, and so it sets it to the wrong time zone. So I've corrected that for the next meeting, and I'm going to look closely when I set up the next meeting to make sure that there's not something in there that also might be picking that up. So again, I apologize to everybody who gets out the wrong time zone. I'll just say it again, that the wording says it very clearly, but it seems everybody just looks at the calendar entry that it creates, and it doesn't seem to create it relative to your time zone. Or if it does, I guess it may have been creating it for the wrong time. So again, we're going to work on that. I apologize for that confusion. It's happened in the last couple weeks, so the last couple meetings, few meetings. But hey, so again, everybody here who missed it, you can watch the recording later. And if I see he's chatting there, yeah, we all do want to say thank you, Brad, for the presentation. And if you missed it, just watch the recording. Brad, I wanted to follow up on something that you said earlier about the, because this is all kind of predicated on someone getting to your stuff on the server. They get your database.
Exactly.
Or they get something else. And one of the points you made was, and therefore if you're going to encrypt something, you're going to need the key to be somewhere, and don't put it in your code. Pull it from an environment variable. And that's kind of leaning towards, you have something like Docker or Kubernetes that's running it, and you can use secrets, and it stores that in the environment variable. But if somebody's got a regular server, well, then something's got to put that environment variable in there. So something I've been wondering about recently is, what would you or other folks that are security people, and I've asked Pete directly recently, what would you recommend if someone has a need to have a password or a key, let's say it's a key, stored? Like it could be a key for reaching out to some third-party service that you don't want someone to be able to grab if they could get on your server and grab it.
Yeah.
Or let's say an encryption key. What would you, or anybody listening, what would you recommend for storing that in some way that can be retrieved programmatically when the application and CF or Lucy starts up, and when the box starts up? It can't be something people type in. And then let me just plant the seed for anybody listening. This also has to do with, like, if you in your code want to have a different username and database value on tags related and functions related to query processing, you can override what's in the admin with a different username and password.
Yeah, or right. It's not just
on a CF mail.
Keys.
You can name the server, the CF mail server username and password. There's so many places where in code someone might want to put, or might feel they have to put, a password, let's say, or in our case, we're discussing encryption keys. So do you have any thoughts on that, Brad, or anybody else?
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities there on what you can do. There's actually even a few services out there, depending on, like, if you're working like inside of AWS, they have some dedicated services for managing secrets, with kind of like an API for accessing them. You mentioned environment variables are obviously very popular when it comes to any kind of Dockerized deployments. But I know that environment variables are a bit foreign, typically for ColdFusion developers. I had never considered using them for any purpose until we got into Docker. at Ortus, and that's kind of how the entire Docker world operates. You can still use environment variables on just a regular standard server. It's just a little unnatural. On like Windows, you have to go into the Windows system property and configure them. It's a little bit harder to script those. You can also use JVM system properties, which people oftentimes speak of interchangeably with environment variables, but JVM system properties are not the same as an environment variable. An environment variable is something that the operating system stores along with the process that it's executing, like your ColdFusion server. If you were to modify like the JVM arguments that were used to start up the Java process, you could set properties there as well. Frameworks like ColdBox have some built-in helpers for accessing environment variables and system properties. Lucy Server since 5.1, I believe, in the server scope has environment variables and system properties available directly as a scope. You don't have to use any Java methods. And ColdFusion 2018, I forget what updater it came in. Maybe it was in the original version. 2018 has also added the same feature. The server scope directly has environment variables and system properties without any need for underlying Java objects. Right. So it's got a little bit more easy to access those.
But all those still have to be set, and they, if someone's on the server and can get the database that you're talking about, well, I guess maybe an argument could be made. Someone could use some break-in approach where all they did was get, let's say, that database, or all they did was get some file, and they're not on the server itself.
Yeah,
so, right, someone's going to say, hey, if someone's on your server, show's over. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, no, you're right. There's oftentimes if they get full access, it doesn't matter, and that is true. A lot of attacks, though, will be sort of like a reflected attack. You might have a SQL injection that allows you to return arbitrary data inside of a select statement that shows up in a search result screen, and so you sort of have to manually shoehorn data in, and they can get any data they want, but they don't just have direct ability to run anything they want. It depends on the level of the exploit. And that's why, you add the layers in with the hope that if someone only gets, halfway access, they still won't be able to find everything. I'll also note, if you're using command box for your deployments, which there are people that use command box for production deployments, it also has some built-in tools like the .env module that makes it easier to manage environment variables as well for your deployments.
That's predicated on those being set in environment variables. So I was just trying to understand if there was something that didn't.
Command box has the ability to read those from like a .env file, and then it injects them into the server process as it starts. So you don't have to use the Microsoft Windows tools for setting environment variables. You can use a module that plugs into command box, and it creates those for you based on maybe a text file or something of that nature. So that's another option. Sometimes even just a very simple layer would be to read it from a file, that's maybe stored on a different drive with very locked down permissions. Maybe when the server first boots up. Obviously, there's still ways that could be accessed, but at least if someone's able to, see the ColdFusion code, maybe they wouldn't be able to locate that. But yeah, it's there's as many ways to do it as there are ways to deploy, which is quite a lot, and so I think different solutions work better for some people based on on what they have set up.
By the way, Adrian has piped in with a couple things about AWS and some other things he's done, and I just want to repeat that.
I mentioned PHP and Node. And that's exactly what the commandbox.env module does, Adrian. We didn't come up with that, right? We ripped it off of everybody else. You can just have a .env file, and then it'll read those in and create those. One of the things you have to be very careful with is the .env file trick. While very handy, it's just a file you put in your web root. Like Apache usually won't serve files that start with a period, but IIS, for instance, will totally serve files that start with a period all day long. It has no qualms in doing so. So you have to be very careful. Gavin Picken showed me once a Google search that would find all the PHP sites on the internet that had a publicly accessible .env file in their web root, and it was horrifying. There were thousands upon thousands of PHP sites, I think made possibly using Laravel, that all they didn't lock down their web server, and you could just directly hit their .env file, and you could just publicly see all of their passwords and secrets. So you have to be very careful with any of those file-based approaches. As much as I like their convenience, making sure your web server isn't going to serve those files up to the internet. Yeah, and you are correct. Typically, with a .env file, you'll keep that out of the code repo, because another vector is that someone might access just like your private GitHub repo, and maybe they can just see the code, but they don't have access to it running on your server. So those .env files are something that you don't commit to the repo. You deploy it along with the code, but it's stored externally. That's a good point. These are good questions. Any other ones?
Looks like there may not be any, and sometimes somebody might be waiting for us to stop the recording and want to ask after that. So
That's fine.
since there's no more,
And
let's
of
go ahead
course,
and
I'm
stop the
I'm
recording.
always available on Twitter or on the CFML Slack team if you
In
guys
fact,
think
you
of
had shared
questions.
that earlier. Why don't you go ahead and type in the chat there the Twitter handle so people can
Yeah,
catch it.
my Twitter handle, which is actually my same username on Slack, is BDW429S. Thank you, Drew.
Yeah. And we do all thank you very much for the talk. And as he said, he hopes to see you do another. And if you look over there, 100% of people said they'd like to see you do another. So if
Uh-oh.
you have another, we'd love to see it.
You know
And
me.
any of you listening in, if you've got presentations, we'd love to have you, everybody. Any talk that's related in any way to CF, we'd be happy to have you. And I'll be looking for people for next year. I've got somebody lined up for next week. I'll announce it later today or tomorrow. And then we'll take off for the Christmas day, obviously, is the day after. And then for the day after, it's like January 1st, we'll see if we do on that day. But anyway, let's go ahead and stop the recording and see if anybody's got anything that they're waiting to ask off the recording.